how do you see the progression of quantum basically like moving over time, right? Like, do you see massive jumps? Do you get a sense of like the pace of acceleration, right? I think if we're drawing a parallel here to maybe like AI, right, you can see largely discounted over time, and then all of a sudden people started to kind of wake up and see, you know, particularly like Nvidia stock just like ripping, right? Do you see quantum like
Yeah.
basically following the same, trajectory as that, or is there a way to kind of track it more closely?
I mean, I asked these guys explicitly this question, which is like, one, like what have been the jumps we've seen, and then do like what are the jumps the community is expecting, right? And there was kind of like it's a very much like it depends on which hardware path you're looking at: superconducting, neutral atom, ion trap, and photonics. So they all have their own different potential kind of next unlocks, and then you have the algorithmic, speed ups, right? There's lots of research going into new quantum algorithms, and so you could get just like in AI, you both have like new chip architectures coming out, right? As well as new algorithmic research. And the combination of those two can lead to breakthroughs. We've seen the most recent kind of unlock was in quantum error correction, which is the whole kind of the major move that has shifted the conversation in quantum computing from kind of what was called like the NISQ era, the noisy intermediate scale quantum computing, which was essentially basically a failed technical project. It was like, basically, can we get something useful out of very noisy systems where we haven't brought the error threshold down? And that failed. And so then the entire industry went into Tracy trying to prove out different methods of doing quantum error correction. And that's been a whole field, but there was a few key breakthroughs. One in particular was Google's demonstration on their Willow chip architecture that by essentially increasing the size of these physical qubits in a certain way with a certain design, they brought the error threshold down exponentially. So actually, getting to that level of fidelity is critical, right? If you have 99%, it's not enough. It's got to be like 99.99%, right? And so that's, but the fidelity is getting to this point now where they feel like the quantum error correction has now reached this basic unlock. There's a bunch of other unlocks that have to happen in terms of like T gates, in terms of 2 qubit systems. There's then the interconnection that you have to have in these different architectures to actually connect in, say a one logical qubit kind of system to, a network system. And that's, a non-trivial thing, right? How do you actually sustain these things over time? So there's lots of very different technical roadmaps. We are not, my view, and I think the view of the folks in the room, was that we're not at this sort of attention is all you need paper. We're not at like the scaling laws, like really kicking in. You just got to throw more compute and data at it, and then you're going to get these exponentials. I think the view is there's a few key, almost fundamental science breakthroughs that they have to hit, and they hope that they can hit them in the next year or two. But once they get to those, then potentially, then it's a scaling issue. That's PsiQuantum's basic thesis, is that they've kind of unlocked a few of these things. They haven't gotten to that last little step, but once they get to that last little step, then they're going to build up this massive facility in Australia that's going to produce millions of these sort of modular chips. It's like an industrial scale sort of wafer, a sort of semiconductor photonics production process. And, they're on the roadmap to creating, big chips for these things. So again, you have to really get into the weeds to make that assessment. I think the zooming out is that you can't rule it out as a possibility. There could be an acceleration, right? So you have to think in terms of scenarios, in terms of a distribution. I think I would say right now, like a 10% or less scenario that we get to some sort of unanticipated fast speed up, where all of a sudden someone gets to a fault-tolerant quantum computer in, say, 2028. That would be like sort of worst case scenario, right? Someone gets there much faster than we think. We're surprised, and we have to like go, oh shit. I think the median scenario, probably 30 to 50%, is somewhere between 2030, 2032, where we get to a fault-tolerant quantum computer. And ideally, it's someone in the West, right? That's a good guy, where there's like constraints of norms about, using that system to attack Bitcoin, right? There's like legal liability if you do that, right? And so potentially that would give a head start to the Bitcoin community, maybe a year or two of a lead before, okay, the bad guys, quote China, can fast follow, right? And potentially use those breakthroughs to attack Bitcoin. And then the best case scenario is actually this is all basically, a bit of exaggeration. We have, almost 10 years or more. These roadmaps are very optimistic, and, we can sort of somewhat more leisurely approach this. And maybe we don't have to like rush into a new post-quantum sort of crypto scheme. We can wait for research to take place, maybe to find a much more sort of memory efficient scheme that isn't going to have all these difficult trade-offs that the current schemes have in terms of the transaction rate, maybe changes to the block size without having to be required, or an enhanced, quantum discount for the witness. It's like, right now there's a bunch of trade-offs. And so I think in terms of scenarios, in terms of distributions, but yeah, that's where we are.
Okay, that's super helpful. Zach, I want to flip over to you here. I want to turn this conversation more towards the kind of Bitcoin discussion and how that's interacting with quantum here. So I presume most people are familiar with the impact that quantum would have on Bitcoin, but maybe it's worth kind of laying that out in detail and talking about kind of the order of operations.
Yeah, so there are two impacts that quantum could have on Bitcoin. One is whether you could come up with a quantum mining algorithm that screws with the game theory around mining. Then the bigger issue is whether you could use quantum computing to basically reverse engineer a private key from a public key, which would undermine the cryptographic safety for Bitcoin holdings. If you had a private key, that no longer means that you are the person that came to own that Bitcoin either by mining or by buying it. You could have come to it by hacking, and that sort of undermines Bitcoin, the asset. There are different levels of security for Bitcoin addresses from this type of hacking. So early keys are more exposed, where you directly expose the public key on the blockchain, and so it would be easier to reverse engineer what the private key is. Addresses that have been reused are more vulnerable. Hashed addresses, modern addresses, are less vulnerable, especially if they've not been reused. And multi-sigs, I think, get a little bit more complicated, but on average, those are safer because it requires multiple keys, each of which would have to be compromised. And so the sort of order of operations is we would like to migrate to a different cryptographic scheme that is quantum resistant before there is a meaningful chance of anything being hacked. And there is that threshold question at that point that Pines was talking about what do we do with the most vulnerable keys, the early Bitcoin addresses where the public key are directly exposed, including, for example, Satoshi's coins. And this is going to be difficult to reach consensus on because there are separate sort of Bitcoin sacred cows that would have to trade off against one another. Would you move over in a hard fork to a system that would burn Satoshi's keys? That would violate the sort of soft fork presumption in Bitcoin that you want someone who's in a coma to be able to wake up after an arbitrary amount of time and still be able to access their wealth. Now, my understanding is hard forks are going to happen in the future with Bitcoin anyway, because of like an inflation bug in the future. And so the question is like, how many exceptions can you make for that? Then there is the question of, okay, if you are burning it, could you confiscate and reuse those keys, right? Maybe to solve the fee market problem by subsidizing block rewards into the future. Or what I personally think is the worst answer to this problem, which is, do you give it to a like Bitcoin Foundation multi-sig and allow certain sort of trusted elders to, use Bitcoin the way that like Ripple uses its stash, right? To promote development and to pay for political influence. Or do you not confiscate the keys? Do you allow them to be hacked and you treat them as valid, right? You do a soft fork of some sort. But now whoever is the hacker could control a large amount of keys, like Satoshi's keys. And you basically allow the system to get hacked, which itself could undermine people's trust in Bitcoin. And so you could end up in a situation where, if we don't get our act together in the United States and pass the Bitcoin Act, it could be China that gets to 1 million coins first if they're the hacker. And they could use that to wreak havoc in the markets. And so before we get to any actual movement of keys, there is the threshold consensus question about what to do to future-proof Bitcoin. Then, there are, as I mentioned, some coins that are more vulnerable than others. There might be a period of time where certain coins are safe and others are not. And then eventually you might get to a system where like there's different sort of computer science that allows you to reverse engineer a hash or something. And then everything is eventually vulnerable. And so we'd have to upgrade to a different type of cryptography altogether, which would require picking which type of cryptography, coming up with a specific BIP to implement it on Bitcoin and getting consensus around that. So I think where we are now in 2025 is we need to remove the, I think, very unhelpful taboo in the Bitcoin community around talking about this. I think we need to treat this seriously. We don't need to have our hair on fire about it, but we should start sort of thinking about these trade-offs and what's acceptable and what's not, and sort of what's the plan going forward. And I think that having a credible plan in place, working towards this, will go a really long way, even if we're not at the final outcome particularly soon.